Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kendall Trump with Grain Journal Magazine in Decatur, Illinois. Welcome to today's webinar, the first in the 2019 series of Lunchbox Safety Docs to be presented by Joe Mlynek, the President and Safety Loss Control Consultant of Progressive Safety Services in Gates Mills, Ohio. Today's webinar will cover Lockout Tagout, the control of hazardous energy. The establishment of an effective energy control program is paramount to preventing injuries and fatalities in the grain handling industry. Today's presenter will cover common energy sources found in grain handling facilities, the causes of lockout-tagout related injuries and fatalities, and situations where lockout-tagout applies, as well as exceptions to the rule. In addition, we will discuss the components of an effective energy control program to include equipment-specific procedures, training, and periodic inspections. Our webinar today is sponsored by CTEC, the lead and founding company of CTEC Ag. CTEC has excelled in servicing the ag industry since 1995 by continuously delivering quality and safety in facility restoration, preventive maintenance, and complete facility modifications. Our webinar is also sponsored by M&M Specialty Services, who specialize in protecting your people with the best in quality and affordability in personal protection products from head to toe and beyond. They are based in Lansing, Kansas. Our speaker, Joe Mlynek's company, Progressive Safety Services, is a safety consulting firm focusing on providing customers with compliance assessments, safety program development, and safety-related training. Joe began his safety career in 1996 and has since worked in industries including grain handling, milling, processing, manufacturing, insurance, construction, and maritime. Joe has more than 15 years of experience in the grain industry. He has a bachelor's degree from Bowling Green State University in Environmental Policy and Analysis and holds certifications as a certified safety professional and an occupational health and safety technologist through the Bureau of Certified Safety Professionals. Joe's presentation today will last approximately 45 minutes and it will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. Questions may be submitted to us today by typing them into the questions box at the right-hand side of your screen at any time during the webinar, and they will be answered during our Q&A session. Tomorrow, participants will receive an email containing a quiz and supervisor talking points. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our website, grainnet.com, within 24 hours. At this time, Joe, can you please do a voice check?
I'm here, Kendall.
Great.
Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Great.
And now, can you please show us your screen?
Sure thing. Just give me one second here.
Sure. Okay.
See it okay?
Yep. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Joe Mlynek.
All right. Good morning to some and good afternoon to others here on the East Coast, and welcome to the first webinar in the 2019 series. So we're going to discuss the control of hazardous energy, otherwise known as Lockout Tagout today. So we will be focusing a lot on some of the compliance issues associated with the standard. Most of what you're going to see today came directly from a review that I performed of the standard and things that I thought were important to incorporate. And then I'll mention some external sources today as well. What we're going to start out today is just talking a little bit about common errors often that companies may make with Lockout Tagout, whether it's misunderstanding of the standard or the actual implementation of a program. We'll discuss when Lockout Tagout applies and when it doesn't apply. We will discuss the components of an effective Lockout Tagout program, training requirements, group Lockout Tagout, Lockout Tagout device removal, some of the contractor requirements, and hopefully toward the end I will try to answer any questions that you may have as well. I wanted to start out with just a incident that occurred several years ago at one of my clients. One of the things when we do webinars and we talk about safety, a lot of times they're so compliance oriented that we forget about kind of the bigger picture with this. And that's the goal of sending employees home safe every day, back to their families, so they can have a healthy and productive life. I don't know the exact date of this. I'm going to say it was probably 3 to 4 years ago. One of my clients had a facility constructed. I think it was 6 steel bins, tower, conveyor, and all the associated equipment. And what had happened, and I was actually out in that state when this actually happened, wasn't at the facility but at another location. After they constructed the bin, they installed the sweep auger, and before they put any grain into the bin, the company that they hired, the design build firm, had several employees that were working to see if the sweep auger was actually going to track properly along the bin floor. I'm going to be real general because I don't want to get any of the details or give you the wrong details, but from what I understand and what I recall of the incident, they had one person that was located inside of a power room that was a distance away from the outside of the bin. They had a person right outside of the opening or the access point to the bin, and the supervisor or the foreman was inside the bin. And they were using, I believe, verbal communication and some hand signals to turn the sweep auger on and off to see if it were tracking properly. The supervisor at the point where he was injured was actually straddling, from what I understand, the sweep auger, and it pulled one of his legs into the sweep auger and kind of wrapped his lower leg around the shaft. When the responders got there, they had to kind of jack up the sweep auger itself to get him out, and obviously you see his clothing there where they had to cut off his clothing. So there were a series of things that could have prevented this. The gentleman that was my client, my contact there, he was the VP of operations at the time, gave me permission to use these photos at the time because he wanted to make sure that this never happened again to somebody. The gentleman that this happened to was a veteran employee, very well respected. He was, the foreman at the site. And I don't know the status today, but the last time I talked to my contact there was probably a year or so ago. He had undergone numerous surgeries over the course of several years. I'm not sure if he ever was able to get back to work or not, but at the point in time that I last made contact, he still couldn't walk. So you think about the impact, from a non-compliance standpoint to a person's life. You have somebody that had made a good living that might not be able to perform that job function anymore. It puts obviously the pain and suffering associated with it, but it also spills, to the family as well and what they have to deal with. Emotionally and financially as well. If you're familiar with workers' compensation or disability, I think the number that's often thrown out is, you'll get 60% of what you normally would make your wages because they don't count overtime and those types of things. So a tremendous impact. Thankfully, he wasn't killed in this incident, but this is the kind of stuff that we're trying to prevent. So I want to just focus on the human element a little bit before we start today because we're going to talk a lot about compliance. But the big picture is preventing incidents like that. There are common errors that are made with lockout tagout, and I think maybe some misconceptions as well. So I do want to give credit where credit is due. This slide here, I took these 5 errors that are listed. I borrowed them from Con, Maciel, and Carey. If you know Eric Kahn, who does a lot of work with his team in the grain industry, they do a webinar series, and the webinars are posted on their website. And they did one last year called Unlock the Mysteries of OSHA's Lockout Tagout Standard. One of the interesting things that they did was they compiled and did some research of all the citations, that they could find, and put them kind of into buckets to find out, where are people getting cited? What are the statistics? What are the areas where companies where they're making errors or mistakes? So the first was failure to develop machine-specific procedures. So there is a distinct definitions or criteria that you have to meet in order to not have equipment-specific procedures, and we're going to talk about that today. The second is failure to conduct periodic inspections of lockout tagout procedures. We're also going to talk about that today as well. The third is failure to establish an energy control program at all, so not having a lockout tagout program. The fourth is failure to provide training to authorized and affected employees. We're going to talk about both of those two different roles today and how you can make sure that your employees are adequately trained. And the fifth is just basically failure to apply lockout tagout in instances where there's servicing or maintenance. So I would encourage you to check out that webinar. It covers a lot of the compliance issues in a little bit more detail than we're going to cover today. I thought it was excellent. So again, that's on their website. So what is lockout tagout? It's specific practices and procedures to safeguard employees from the unexpected energization or startup of machinery or equipment, or the release of hazardous energy during servicing and maintenance. So you'll see this term unexpected and servicing and maintenance quite frequently, and we'll talk more about that as we go through today's webinar. But one of the things in the Con Maciel and Carey webinar that I found interesting is that the word unexpected is italicized in OSHA's standard. And I believe what they mentioned was it's the only word that was italicized in the standard, which is meant to put emphasis on it. And there's actually an effort that's ongoing with OSHA to take out some of the ambiguous words or words that might be a little confusing or be up to the interpretation. But the stance with unexpected is it's truly unexpected. So for instance, if I had somebody that was going to be, we were doing some testing on a machine or something of that nature, and they were going to turn it on, normally it would be we were going to remove a guard, something like that, and the person was in the area and they were warned in some manner, whether it's an audible alarm, somebody on a radio, handheld radio, flashing lights that the equipment was about to start, that is not really deemed as unexpected. I kind of take that with a grain of salt, just being a safety guy, but truly they focus on this word unexpected, which is kind of interesting. And you may see that word at some point removed in the future, but I don't know what the details of that are. The second piece here is, it requires the placing of locks and tags on an energy isolating device to prevent the release of hazardous energy, and then have steps to verify that the energy has been isolated. So when we talk about an energy isolating device, this is another term that's common. It's a definition. It's the device that physically prevents the transmission of energy. So energy can come in many forms. Most commonly, we deal a lot of times with electrical energy, so it might be something like a circuit breaker or an on-off disconnect. It could be a valve for pneumatics or hydraulics as well. So that's what an energy isolating device is. So the standard covers a lot of what we call servicing and maintenance. Again, that word unexpected comes up as well. And really the focus here is to prevent harm to employees. Things like the injury that we just talked about. You may be aware of amputations that have happened because somebody didn't lock and tag out a piece of equipment and it unexpectedly energized, and even death. So, in my career, I had one incident, and it occurred probably, I think, 5 years ago now, where an employee entered a grain tank. It was a hopper bottom tank, not too terribly big. They entered without a permit. They didn't get permission from their supervisor to enter. In fact, he told them not to enter, and they decided to enter anyway. And we had a cone bottom tank where one employee, when he got in there, it was wet because they were kind of hosing out the cone to clean out some of the material. And he slid down into this, into the bottom of this hopper bottom tank, and there was a clean out auger there that was unguarded and running. And, normally these guys, and in the past they had filled out permits, and there's always a checkbox on there for locking and tagging out equipment. In this instance, they failed to do that. This employee's leg was caught in that auger, and it took his leg clean off of his body. I'd never seen autopsy photos quite like it, or photos immediately after the incident. So again, those are the types of things, the bigger picture things that we're trying to prevent here. Again, we're going to talk about compliance, but that's really the ultimate goal. When we talk about energized energy sources, that can mean anything connected to an energy source or containing residual or what we call stored energy. So there are stored energy systems as well that we need to be concerned about when we perform lockout tagout. And common energy sources include, electrical, mechanical, hydraulic, pneumatic, chemical, thermal. There's other springs, gravity, but there are a lot of different energy sources out there. I think, commonly in our industry, there's still a lot of equipment that you can just lock out by successfully with just an on-off disconnect. But there is also that equipment out there that can move, shift unexpectedly as well, because there are other energy sources present. So servicing and maintenance, we've talked a little bit about that term. It's used continually throughout the standard. It consists of activities like constructing, installing, setting up, adjusting, inspecting, modifying, or even maintaining equipment. So in this particular picture here, there was some employees that had removed the cover on the drag conveyor. And I think in this one, I was doing an audit. This was just last year. I think they were actually just cleaning up some residual material, but they were obviously trained, because when we do an inspection and see something like this, the first question that we ask is, is it locked out? Because we've removed a safety device or a guard, in my opinion, the top cover. And we do that not to, try to place blame on somebody if it isn't, but we also want to note that they're doing it successfully. So when we went to the energy isolating device for this, we found that it was locked and tagged out by a number of people using group lockout to perform this task. So they were doing cleaning, which is servicing, maintenance, those types of things. Some of the other activities that would be lumped into servicing and maintenance might be lubrication, cleaning or unjamming of machines and equipment, making tool changes, and anywhere where the employee might be exposed again to the unexpected energization or startup of equipment or release of stored energy. So that's during servicing or maintenance. There are also normal operations, when that equipment, that picture that I just showed you is normally operating. There's a cover over the top of it, and it prevents anybody from coming into contact with the hazard. So normal production operations aren't covered by the standard, but servicing or maintenance, which take place during normal operations, is covered if an employee is required to remove or bypass a guard or other safety device. So like the instance that we just talked about, if that covers on that equipment, an employee can work around it. Obviously, normal production, he's protected. No need for lockout tagout. However, if they're performing servicing or maintenance type operations, they remove or bypass that guard or other safety system, it has to be locked and tagged out. Or anytime any employee is required to place any part of his or her body into an area of the machine or piece of equipment where work is actually performed upon the material being processed. So that's what we commonly refer to as the point of operation, or when an associated danger zone exists during the machine operating cycle. So point of operation, commonly when I think about point of operation, I think about a part or a piece of material where work is being performed to it, a hole punch or something of that nature. But, when we think about processing, although we're not really processing in all of our grain operations, all this equipment that we use to move material, if somebody's required to place their hand or anything in that machine or somewhere into that hazard zone, lockout tagout would be required. Now there are a lot of exceptions, not a lot, there's several exceptions to lockout tagout, two that I believe that we'll speak of today, where lockout tagout is not required. Your company may not choose to honor any of the exceptions. So just as an example, I have clients that we have what we call minor intervention language within their policy, and I have others that we don't. Generally, what I'm about to talk about here with the first exception is often used in kind of production environments, and I'll give you some examples of that. So there's an exception to performing lockout tagout during minor tool changes and adjustments and other servicing activities which take place during normal production operations. They're not covered if they are routine, repetitive, and integral to the use use of equipment for production. And that's provided that the workers perform using alternative measures which provide effective protection. So in an effort not to confuse today, I'm going to give you an example of something that's routine, repetitive, and integral to the use of equipment for production. So I've worked with several companies that have bagging operations, and they'll fill, bags of all different type sizes with, it might be flour, fertilizer, whatever it might be. And generally you'll find like a bag sealer or a box sealer. And lately with automation, these types of pieces of equipment are interlocked. So there's a plexiglass enclosure around them. And when I open the two doors in the front, it automatically will cut the power, the control power to the unit, and stop the operation. So one of the things that would be routine would be the need to maybe, if it's a box machine, they have to replace the roll of tape or the box sealer that they put on the top of it. And they'll have to do that, repetitively. It's routine. It happens every day, maybe several times a day. It is repetitive, means that it happens, again, routinely. And it's integral to production as well. So the exception allows that as long as there is an alternative measure which provides effective protection. In this case, it's the interlock doors on the front of the machine. One of the clients that I worked with, actually several of them, have taken this kind of a step further. So before that employee opens those doors, he hits the emergency stop button on the equipment or adjacent to the equipment. He disconnects any of the pneumatic air lines going into the equipment. He puts an actual do not operate tag on the emergency stop to warn us and the employees around him. And then he opens the actual doors in front to replace that. So again, that is only used for things that are routine, repetitive, and integral to production. So within our presentation today, you're going to see some red highlighted stuff. And these are things that that I want to put some emphasis, or what I call best practices, things that I think are a good idea. So a best practice, if you have things that would meet this routine, repetitive, and integral to production, would be to have what I would call like a minor intervention procedure, and that would actually lay out the steps for the actual employee to use that exception and how that works, just like the example that I just used. So again, in many grain operations, I think, conveyors, bucket elevators, it's a little bit different than production, so I'm not sure how much the exception would actually apply to that. But if you do have, production type operations at your facility, that exception does exist. The second one is the standard does not apply if somebody is working on cord and plug connected equipment for which exposure to the hazards of unexpected energization or startup can be controlled by unplugging the equipment from the energy source. And then the plug has to be under the exclusive control of the employee performing the servicing or maintenance. So they have to have the plug close by or be able to prevent anybody from plugging it in while they're working on it. There's an exception for hot tap operations and things of that nature. Quite frankly, I don't get into that line of work, but I did want to just mention that. So with cord and plug equipment, exclusive control would mean if I'm working on maybe a piece of equipment, trying to think of one that's portable on a cord, small conveyor that you plug into the wall to use in certain instances. If the cord's running around the corner and down the hallway to the plug and I'm working on the equipment, that isn't exclusive control. But I have it in my immediate work area and I could prevent somebody from plugging it in, I could most likely use the exception. Now, I want to make sure that people understand that this exception is only for corded equipment. That doesn't mean if somebody removes a guard on a V-belt drive and the on-off disconnects right next to them, that since they have exclusive control and could prevent somebody from turning it on, they could use this exception. They cannot. This is only for corded equipment. So the best practice, in my opinion, is we train on this and we really encourage our clients to use cord or plug lockouts for a number of reasons. One is, the instances that we just talked about. It can be very difficult to make sure that the plug is right next to the person. They can prevent that. But also in the event that the servicing or maintenance taking place doesn't get completed during that shift, if there's a plug lockout on it, somebody will not use it because the machine might not be safe to use. So that's one of the exceptions as well. I thought for today's presentation as well, we'd take little breaks throughout and I could just give you like a 1-minute focus on some incidents that have actually occurred out in the workplace. So I picked a few of them. I got these right off of OSHA.gov. These are little scenarios where people were actually cited for lockout tagout related incidents. So the first one I want to share with you today is at 10:15 a.m. on December 12, 2017, an employee was working for a firm that produced converted paper products, an example of slit and twisted paper. He was working with a twisting machine. While the machine was still running, he removed the guard from a pulley-driven belt to check the belt. He was using his hands to push the belt to move faster. When his finger got caught in the pulley, he sustained an amputation of the ring finger on his right hand. He was not hospitalized for that. So another example where we had a person who removed a guard on a piece of equipment, and based on the definitions that we looked at earlier, lockout tagout is required when that happens. So let's talk a little bit about energy control programs. And keep in mind that when I talk about the programs today, your company may go above and beyond what we discuss, and that's excellent. I'm going to talk to the things that are actually required from the actual OSHA standard. So the energy control program must consist of primarily 3 things. You may have additional things in there like provisions for contractors and things of that nature, but it must control energy control procedures or procedure, employee training, and then periodic inspections, and we're going to talk about each one of these. So procedures shall be developed and utilized for the control of potentially hazardous energy, and they should be equipment specific. So the common question that we get is, how do I know if I have to have an energy control procedure specifically for that piece of equipment? And there are actually these, 7 criteria here that if you meet all of these, your equipment meets all of these, you could have more of a general type procedure that you could use at your facility. If it doesn't meet all of these criteria, then you would have to have an equipment-specific procedure. So it's really, looking at the machine and then taking it through these questions or a matrix and determining whether or not it needs an equipment-specific procedure. So the exception to having equipment-specific procedures, again, you'd have to meet all of the following. The machine or equipment has no potential for stored or residual energy or reaccumulation of energy after shutdown. So stored energy, if you have that with the equipment, automatically has to have equipment-specific procedure. The machine or equipment has a single energy source which can be readily identified and isolated. The third is the isolation and locking out of the energy source will completely de-energize and deactivate the equipment. The fourth is the machine or equipment is isolated from the energy source and locked and tagged out during servicing or maintenance. A single lockout device will achieve a locked out condition. So what they mean by a single lockout device is I would have one lock and tag on an energy isolating device like a breaker. If I had to place one on the disconnect electrical, and then I had valves or pneumatics, hydraulics. That's a different story. That, again, that would require equipment-specific procedure. The sixth is the servicing or maintenance does not create hazards for other employees. And the last one is the employer has had no accidents involving the unexpected activation or re-energization of the equipment. So you kind of have to look at your equipment individually. If it meets all of these criteria, if it doesn't meet these criteria, I guess it would be a better way to say it. You would have to have an equipment-specific procedure. If energy-controlled procedures are required in the workplace, there's some components that have to be within that procedure. They have to clearly outline the scope, purpose, authorization, rules, and techniques utilized to control the hazardous energy, specific statement of the intended use of the procedure, specific procedural steps for shutting down, isolating, blocking, or securing machines or equipment to control hazardous energy, and specific procedural steps for the placement, removal, and transfer of lockout devices, tagout devices, and other energy control measures. So this is just a generally accepted lockout tagout procedure, that we use to get started with folks. We use a 7-step process, and then we use a 5-step process to put something back into service. So altogether, our process is 12 steps. Your company may have less, they may have more. This is, again, just generally accepted. Step 1 is to notify affected employees. Those are folks that might operate a machine. They might just be the equipment operator on which, that piece of equipment is going to be serviced or maintenance, or maybe they work in the general area or are required to work close to or around. So we notify them. We identify the type or types of energy associated with the equipment. We shut down the equipment using, normal operating means, stop button, PLC, something like that. Deactivate the energy isolating device or devices. We place those in an off position. We lock and tag the energy isolating devices, dissipate or restrain any stored energy that might be in the system. And then number 7 is we verify that the equipment is disconnected from the energy source. So lockout, tagout, try. I find if I can get employees just to remember that quick saying, particularly with the try. So we really focus a lot with our training efforts on the verification piece. It's so important. Now, this is a little bit different scenario. This was somebody that was actually doing some electrical work, but it's a good example of the verify piece or the try piece of the procedure. So lockout tagout, the process is also referenced within OSHA's electrical standard as well. It's very similar language. And what happened in this instance, and I pulled this picture from somebody posted this on LinkedIn, and it was a person that does electrical work, and said, make sure that you always verify. So what had happened here is when he put the on-off disconnect, the 3-phase into the off position, one of the knives didn't engage. In fact, it kind of broke off. So we have 2 that are are not engaged, and we have 1 that's still live. One of the phases is still live. So when this employee, he didn't open up the panel when he turned it off and put his lock and tag on that. But before he started his work, he did the right thing. He did not skip that step that says verify. And when he verified using his electrical testing equipment, he picked up voltage, which caused him to go back to this panel, open it up, and find out what the problem was. And this is what he found. So I always like this picture. It's a good example of why we want to verify things are in a locked out, tagged out condition. With a lot of our equipment, it can be as simple as pushing a start button. Now, when we remove the equipment and re-energize something, we have a 5-step process that we follow. We want to make sure that the equipment is operationally intact. We check the work area to make sure that it's safe, everything's picked up, guards are back in place, all those types of things. We verify that the controls are in neutral if there's the possibility of what we call hard start. We remove our lockout tagout devices, and then we will notify at the end of the servicing and maintenance when the devices are removed that it's safe to work in the area. The equipment has been released back into service. So we'll skip back here on our 1-minute focus again, and we'll want to talk about another incident that happened to somebody, and this one's kind of near and dear to the grain industry. So at 5:45 p.m. on July 9th, 2018, employee number 1 was attempting to empty the remaining corn from the inside of a grain bin while the sweep auger was running. The rotating blade of the sweep auger made contact with the employee's left leg, resulting in severe lacerations. The employee exited the grain bin and was later found dead in his truck. He died from blood loss as a result of severe lacerations sustained from contact with the sweep auger blade. So lockout tagout is obviously mentioned as well within the grain handling standard for entry into bin silos and tanks. And anything that would pose a risk to the employee or a hazard to the employees inside the tank should be locked and tagged out. So I know that everybody's aware of 10 sweep auger safety principles for entry. So there are some, I'm not going to call them exceptions, but other things that you can do like guarding and things of that nature so that you don't have to lock and tag it out. But there are certain states out there as well that I'm aware of that don't allow the use of that the 10 sweep auger principles that were agreed on by federal OSHA. So you'll have to know your state's rules with those. Some states say, hey, it's got to be locked out before you go in, no matter what you do. So again, we know that sweep augers are dangerous to our employees. I did want to talk as well quickly about procedures, and actually one of the things with the procedures is that you have to inspect them on an annual basis as well, or routinely on an annual basis. So they expect that for each procedure you have out in the facility that an authorized person who is not performing the actual lockout tagout would observe that and inspect that process as well as review that procedure with the employees. If you have a lot of procedures out there that are equipment specific, you can group pieces of equipment that are very similar in nature with a similar lockout tagout process. I want to talk a little bit about protective materials and hardware. These are things like locks, tags, hafts, gang boxes, those types of things. Lockout and tagout devices must be singularly identified and used only for controlling energy. So generally lockout tagout locks in facilities, they're color coded, red in color. When I look at those, I know that they're used for lockout tagout. On top of that, some of them may as well have some language on them, some warning language on them, as well as a little area where the employee can put their name on it as well. So, and I get a lot of questions too, do I have to have a tag or can a lock with warning language and the person's, some identifier on there like their name, is that acceptable? And my understanding is as long as you have warning language and it's identifiable that it would be okay. I'm still kind of old school. I like a lock and a separate tag together. This equipment has to withstand the work environment. So it's got to be able to, weather conditions, all those types of things. It has to be constructed and printed so that weather conditions or wet or damp locations will not cause the tag to deteriorate. Tags shall not deteriorate in corrosive environments, things of that nature. And devices must be standardized within the facility by either color, shape, or size. And tag devices' print and format shall be standardized as well. So generally, again, we see lockout locks that are red, they're standardized, those types of things. The equipment should be substantial enough to prevent removal without the use of excessive force or unusual techniques. That would be, using bolt cutters, maybe some type of a cutting tool like a hand grinder, something of that nature. The tagout devices have to be substantial enough to prevent inadvertent removal. And again, they have to be identifiable. So lockout and tagout devices must indicate the identity of the employee applying the devices. So I have been aware of some citations that have been issued that folks maybe just used a tag or just used a lock to lock something out without a tag, or they used a lock and a the tag was not identifiable with the person's name or some type of identifier. And that's really important as well in the event that somebody leaves a lock on a piece of equipment. So locks and keys, there's a number of ways that you can purchase them. You can order them with, one key. You can order them with 2 keys that are, duplicate keys. But they must be designated for one user. So the company's policies will be different regarding this. So I work with companies that say, no, we're going to order locks with one key and we'll assign the employee their lock and key, and that way nobody else has a duplicate key so that somebody else can't remove their lock. And then I work with employers as well that say, no, we order them with two keys. The second key is secured in a locked box or a cabinet. And we would only use that after going through our device removal procedure or permit, and that would only be used by, maybe a maintenance manager or facility manager, something of that nature. I think either one of those is fine as long as there is an effective program or policy with that. The last thing you want is keys kind of floating around where somebody else can get their hands on them. So this is one of my favorite pictures, and I'll give you a little bit of background with this. This employee, his name's Rick. I don't think Rick is still working, so I'll use his name. And I was doing an inspection probably 15, 20 years ago in a fabrication shop, and Rick was working on a shear, metal shear, so it can cut 1/4 inch steel, probably all the way up to 1/2 inch. And as I walked up to Rick, I see him underneath this machine, and I noticed that he's got some of the mechanisms within the machine blocked up because he's worried about them drifting. There's stored energy, so he's doing a pretty good job with that. And then the next thing I do is kind of just do a walk around the machine to see if there's any other hazards, and then we walk over to see if it's locked and tagged out. If it is, we're going to note that in the report that it was successfully locked and tagged out, just as a positive observation. When I walked up, I saw the lock and the tag, and I was happy. And then I saw the key in the lock. And I was taught many, many years ago by a gentleman named Bob Momini. He's no longer with us, but he taught me, I went to a lot of his seminars, that the one thing with lockout tagout you should always think about is somebody's going to try to remove your lock. So you don't want to give them the opportunity to do that. So one way would be letting a key float around or leaving the key in there. So when I grabbed Rick and said, Rick, come here, I want to just have a conversation with you real quickly about this. I said, Rick, listen, the key's got to come out of the lock. The last thing, and I don't think this will happen, but the last thing you would want when you're working on a machine, any machine, is the ability for somebody to remove that lock and turn it on while you're working on it. And you've kind of given them that opportunity. I don't think they would do that, but you've given them that, the probability is pretty low, but it could happen. And he understood. So I said, why would you do that? And he said, Joe, and he pulled out this big key ring. And he goes, I have so many keys, and a lot of them look alike, that I didn't want to lose that key in the shuffle, so I decided to leave it in the lock. So we had a nice conversation, a little maybe come to Jesus meeting there, and he understood and he got it. But always an interesting photo. So back to this periodic inspections of your procedures that you have there. The standard indicates that the employer shall conduct periodic inspections of the energy control procedure or procedures at least annually to ensure that they're being followed. And they have to be performed by an authorized employee other than the one that's actually performing the lockout tagout. And inadequacies or deficiencies during the inspection process of that procedure need to be corrected pretty much immediately after. So again, if you have kind of one general procedure because all of your equipment meets all those criteria we talked about earlier, it becomes pretty simple to do, the annual inspection or the routine inspection. But if you have 50, 60, 70 different procedures out there, it becomes very time consuming. So I have a letter of interpretation that I found today, and I reference it at the end of the webinar today if you want to check it out. It talks about, can you group pieces of equipment together, and it gives you some stipulations that you could, as long as, the lockout tagout procedure is very similar, same type of energy isolation, same type of energy isolation devices, those types of things. So that can make it a little bit easier for you. But again, that's similar pieces of equipment. If they're not, they would have to be inspected as well. So in my experience, this is one of the most challenging things that companies probably aren't as compliant with as the rest of what we're talking about today is the actual inspection process. So the periodic inspection must also include a review between the inspector and each authorized employee of that employee's responsibility under the energy control procedure being inspected. And then the inspections, you know, as like anything, they need to be certified. So within the standard, they tell you what that means. And the certification means it's the identity of the machine or equipment, the date of the inspection, the employees included in the inspection, and the person performing the inspection. So a best practice for inspecting your procedures, you know, at least annually, it says routinely or at least annually, is to have a checklist approach. So the inspection checklist that we use is just a series of questions that the authorized person will ask the team as they're out there and review as they're going through their lockout tagout, just to make sure. If there are any deficiencies at that point in time, he will review that with them and then make a determination whether or not they have to have some additional training as well. So it's best to, you know, have a document for that as well. Which leads us into our next topic, which is actually the training side of lockout tagout. So really the focus of training needs to be the purpose and the function of your company's energy control program. And we have to ensure that employees have knowledge and skills required for the safe application, usage, and removal of energy controls. So the training must include recognition of applicable hazardous energy sources, the types and magnitude of energy available in the workplace, and the method and means necessary for energy isolation and control. And there's really two different characterizations or types of employees that need to be trained. There's an authorized employee and an affected employee. So, you know, the common elevator that I go to, anywhere from 5 to 25 employees generally, maybe less, maybe more. Generally, everybody's authorized to perform lockout tagout. I do have clients. I have one in Northeast Ohio that only authorizes certain people to do perform servicing and maintenance on equipment. And the rest of the folks that operate those pieces of equipment or those machines do not perform servicing or maintenance, but they are affected. They're considered affected employees. So there's two different types of people today that need to be trained. If you authorize everybody, it makes it really simple. If you have affected employees, you can have a short basic training for them. So an affected employee, again, operates or uses a machine or equipment on which servicing or maintenance is being performed under lockout tagout. And an authorized employee is a person who locks or tags out machines or equipment in order to perform servicing or maintenance. So when we look at an authorized, requirements include, you know, they have to have knowledge and skills for safe application, use, and removal of energy isolating devices, hazardous energy source recognition, the type and magnitude of hazardous energy sources in the workplace, and then training on the energy control procedures within the workplace as well. An affected employee, again, is usually a machine operator or a user. They operate the relevant machinery, or their jobs require them to be in the area where servicing or maintenance is being performed. So the training requirements for an affected employee are the purpose and use of the energy control procedures, how to recognize when energy control procedures are in place, and then the importance of not tampering with or removing lockout tagout devices. So it's just some basic training with them. We generally get that done pretty quickly, less than a half hour. And then retraining needs to be conducted with employees whenever there is a change in any of the following: their job assignments, equipment or processes that present a new hazard, energy changes in energy control procedures, or again, if a periodic inspection reveals that there are shortcomings in an employee's knowledge of the lockout tagout procedures themselves. So this will be our last 1 minute focus here today. We're going to hit on our last incident. So employee number one on June 19, 2018 at 12 p.m. was servicing a mobile conveyor. The employee was found later that evening with his leg caught in the conveyor under its sprockets. The conveyor was not running when he was found, but the key was in the controls. The conveyor had not been locked out during servicing activities, and the throat opening guard had been removed to allow the maintenance work to take place. The employee was pronounced dead on the scene. So again, we have another one where a guard was removed and servicing and maintenance is being performed without lockout tagout. Okay, let's get into device removal. So company may address this in several different ways. There are some companies that say that, hey, if somebody leaves a lock and tag on a piece of equipment and they leave for the day, they leave the move a lock, they have to come and remove it themselves. But there is an exception that an employer may use. So generally, under normal conditions, each lockout or tagout device shall be removed from an energy isolating device by the employee who applied it. However, there is this exception that the employer may use. When the authorized employee who applied the lockout or tagout device is not available to remove it, that device may be removed under the direction of the employer, provided that they meet the following. The first is specific procedures and training for removal have been developed, documented, and incorporated into the employer's energy control program. And the second is the employee can demonstrate that the specific procedure provides can demonstrate that the specific procedure provides equivalent safety to the removal of the device by the authorized employee who applied it. So the specific removal procedure itself must include the following. And again, all of this comes from the employee who applied the device is not at the facility. So the first thing, we train on with the folks that are involved in device removal is we have to make sure that we've checked to make sure that that employee is actually still not at the facility. And sometimes that involves checking the time clock, those types of things to see if they punched out for the day. The second is making all reasonable efforts to contact the authorized employee to inform them that their lockout or tagout device has been removed. And the third is ensuring that the authorized employee has knowledge of the removal before they resume work at the facility. So one of the things that, with the second piece there is making reasonable efforts to contact them. And we, in our procedure, they have to make reasonable efforts, and if they can't contact the person to get their permission to remove the lock, that decision is made by a permit process that's generally put in place by the facility manager or somebody that's in an authorized position. So as a best practice, what I would recommend, if you choose to include this exception within your program, is to define what a reasonable effort is to contact an authorized employee. So I have one client that we said, what's a reasonable effort, and we came up with 3 separate attempts to contact them, either on their cell phone or at their home phone. Well, we learned later that people would make 3 consecutive attempts to contact them on their cell phone within 10 minutes. So if the guy went in to eat lunch somewhere, left his phone in his car, he's not going to, obviously he's going to miss the 3 attempts to contact him. So we would put a time limit to that. Maybe it's over the course of an hour or 2 hours, something of that nature. The other piece is you can require the employee to come back to the facility if possible and have them remove their own lock. So I have some contractor employees that I work with, some of the grain companies out there. If they leave the site and leave a lock on something, they will not remove it. They require that person to come back and remove it themselves, which can be very time consuming, I guess is a good way to put it. Really, what we do with our clients, and I've seen a number of companies do this as well. I was working with a company in Nebraska last week that does this, is to develop a permit system that ensures that the required elements that we've discussed today and an inspection of the equipment by an authorized person takes place before removing and restarting a piece of equipment. So we have to remember that, when somebody leaves a lock and a tag on a piece of equipment, it could be for several different reasons. One, because they just inadvertently left for the day. I mean, they got sidetracked and they left and forgot to take that off and put it back into service. It could also be locked and tagged out because it's not safe to operate. And maybe he's waiting on parts, or maybe, there are issues with that. So we just don't want to assume that somebody just left it on there because they were forgetful for the day. There might be a reason behind that. So that's why it's so important to do the inspection, make the attempts to contact the person as well. There's also somewhat of an exemption for testing and positioning, which I know would take place, belt tracking, things of that nature. So there's some language in the standard that says situations may require lockout tagout devices to be temporarily removed and the equipment energized to test or position the machine require certain actions. So if you had to remove lockout and tagout devices to jog something to see if it's tracking properly, the standard allows for that as long as you make sure that the following actions are taken. The first is clear the machine or equipment of tools and materials, remove employees from the machine or equipment area, remove the lockout tagout devices, energize and proceed with the testing and positioning, and then de-energize and reapply the energy control measures as well. Again, I'm aware of companies out there that do not use, an exception like that as well. So that's up to your company. Wanted to touch on group lockout, very important. This takes place when there are situations where servicing or maintenance is performed by a crew, department, or group, and a group lockout device must be used, something like a HASP or gang box, something of that nature. So primary responsibility in a group lockout must be vested in an authorized employee for a set number of employees working under the protection of the group lockout tagout or device. So when we have multiple people that are working on a piece of equipment, there's one authorized employee who takes kind of responsibility for that lockout tagout. That authorized employee must ascertain the exposure status of the individual group member with regard to lockout or tagout of the machine. And each authorized employee shall affix their lockout tagout device to the group lockout device when he or she begins work and remove those devices when he or she stops working on the machine or equipment. So I have a client that they have to scrape elevator leg buckets to clean them in between product runs. Supervisor, usually 3 employees in separate areas along the leg that work on this. Supervisor puts his lock and tag on the HASP along with all of the other employees involved in the operation. As each one is done with their individual job, they remove their lock and tag. The supervisor is the last one to remove his lock and tag after he's inspected the equipment to make sure that it's safe to be put back into service. Pretty simple process. If you do have shift or personnel changes, continuity of lockout should always be considered. So that continuity of lockout is really provisions for the orderly transfer of lockout tagout between the offgoing and oncoming employees. So it can be as simple as what we call a handoff. We use a HASP. I have my lock and tag on the piece of equipment on the HASP. Jim comes in on second shift. He puts his lock and tag on the HASP and I take mine off. You could also have somebody put one on in between the actual exchanges as well. So include language in the energy control program for those types of things. With outside contractors, very important, the on-site or the host employer, which would be most of the folks on the line today, and the outside employer have to inform each other of their respective lockout tagout procedure, and then the host employer shall ensure that his or her employees understand and comply with any restrictions and that kind of thing. I think with contractors, best practices, when you go through your contractor safety training, that there's a checkbox somewhere on your checklist that talks about lockout tagout. And then one of the things that a lot of our clients do, and we encourage them to do as well, if a contractor locks something out, an authorized person from the host employer will also lock that equipment out as well. And then when the contractor's done, they'll remove their locks, and then host employer will do an inspection of the area and be the last to remove their locks as well. Labeling, there are requirements for labeling according to communicate purpose of energy isolating devices. This isn't something that's talked about in the standard, but it's something that I encourage folks to do as well. I see a lot of different labeling systems out there. A lot of them use common language or directions, west, east, north, south. Just keep in mind when directions are used that you may have a contractor or a new employee or even an employee at your facility. He doesn't know the west conveyor from the east conveyor. So we encourage folks to use an alphanumeric coding system. And I'll give you an example. I've been using these pictures for 15, 20 years now. This is an air compressor. You can see it used to be labeled number 1. It's now AC 103, air compressor 103. There's 101, 102, 103, 104, and so on. They can quickly look at the identification tag when they're performing servicing or maintenance on this air compressor. When they go into the power room, they just match it up, AC 103. You see that the old system was north compressor, and the north compressor was labeled number 1. The two didn't match up. So it's somewhat of a foolproof system that I encourage people to look at as well. I know we're pressing on time here today. I actually cut out a little bit of the presentation to try to make it run a little quicker, but I did reference earlier the ConMACL and Carry webinar. Excellent information, a lot of what we talked about today. Obviously, there's the OSHA standard that you can refer to as well, the control of hazardous energy. On OSHA.gov, if you look up numerous questions on lockout tagout under 1910.147 and subpart S, there's a gentleman that wrote in and asked about 10 different questions, a lot of the ones that you probably have right now, and they answered all of those for him. So it's a letter of interpretation that's out there. We have some supervisor talking points that I know Kendall's going to send out to everybody in a quiz if you wanted to do some additional training with your staff as well. And I would also encourage folks, you can always call your local area office and ask questions of the compliance officer on duty. It's something that I do routinely. If you're worried about the office close to you, you can call one in another area of your state. It's all anonymous. You just ask the question. So they can help with some of these questions as well. So Kendall, I guess we'll try to take questions for a minute or two.
Sure. Thank you so much for a great presentation, Joe. Real quick, we'll go ahead and run through some questions. Okay, Joe, our first question. Regarding annual periodic inspections, you stated procedures may be grouped. Can a group of authorized employees be reviewed, or must documentation truly be one-on-one?
I think you could do it with the group of employees for that specific piece of equipment. I'm going to go ahead while I have folks on the line, and hopefully people will stick around. I'm going to read to you this from the letter of interpretation that I was referencing, and the questions as well, just to give you everybody some additional information. It says, is every lockout tagout procedure required to have a periodic inspection, or can lockout procedures be grouped for machines that are of similar construction and operation? And the reply from OSHA was, an employer may group distinct procedures associated with similar machines or equipment and consider the group of distinct procedures to be a single procedure for purposes of conducting a periodic inspection if the machines or equipment in the group have the same or similar types of control measures. Grouping energy control procedures for same or similar machines or equipment for inspection purposes may streamline the inspection and the review process, since there will be a smaller number of procedures than procedure groups than individual procedures. Thus, an employer may elect to group procedures as described above, and then inspect a representative number of such employees implementing one procedure within each group. So that gives you some additional information. So yes, I think you can do that in a group setting. That's my understanding of it.
Okay, that's all that we can really do for questions today since we're short on time. I want to thank everyone for their participation today. I want to go ahead and thank our sponsors, C-Tech Ag and M&M Specialty Services, for this informative program presented by Joe Mlynek of Progressive Safety Services. Be sure to sign up for Grain Journal's Safety e-newsletter, providing safety news for the grain and feed industries. It comes out the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month. You can subscribe to this and other newsletters at grainnet.com/enews. And if you aren't already doing so, you can now follow GrainNet Safety News on Twitter, as well as connect with other grain and feed safety professionals on GrainNet Safety Group on LinkedIn. For more information on these social networking opportunities, please visit GrainNet and click on the Twitter and LinkedIn logos. As a note, this webinar has been recorded and it will be posted to our website, grainnet.com, within 24 hours. Links to the recording and our slides will also be emailed to all registrants. You can view this and other past webinars at grainnet.com/webinars. Also, our next Lunchbox Safety Talk with Joe Mlynek is scheduled for Tuesday, March 5th at 11:30 a.m. Central Time, and will cover fall protection and ladder safety. I want to thank you all for attending and wish you all a great day.